Are you renting or buying? What's the cost difference?
Can't just say this area is it for you.
And it's funny how mind just isolates something. You know, people isolate something and go for it, and then they don't consider the larger context of what I actually said.
Yeah.
We're about to go around the grounds all across Australia and unpack some of the greatest questions with these certain markets. What's going on in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth? We're going to uncover it all with the data expert, Matt, in round 2 with Matt. How are you, Matt?
Good, man. Nice to be here.
Yeah.
I'm pumped.
It's pretty awesome. I'm going to start with the juicy question that Adi had picked up recently. I want you to ask it again. Can you put Matt on the spot?
I would love to. I just want to see him getting riled up. So, Matt, as founder of Hashtag, right, between you and Alex, you guys are at the forefront of what's evolving in the buyer's agency space, right? Now, I've seen this narrative that Matt is flogging this area, Matt is flogging this area. Mm-hmm. Now, you're the data guy. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine you flogging anything. But there's a narrative because you talk about something purely as a consequence of some search that comes up on Hashtag. Mm-hmm. Really curious to hear your thoughts. Like, how do you approach that sort of?
It does happen. It does happen, and recently more so than before. And it usually happens in the context when somebody else is flogging something else. Mm-hmm. Mm. So when there is a juxtaposition, then they latch onto it. And that. Initially I'm worried about that concept that I'm flogging something because I'm not speaking to an individual who's going to invest there. So I don't know who they are, their financial circumstance. And I personally never flog areas, as you know. I say, okay, what is your brief? What are you going to buy under, etc. But it is happening, and that honestly tells me that they just don't understand either what I'm doing, or people don't understand investing. But at the same time, it could be a marketing ploy. It could be, it usually happens if a certain cohort is promoting one side of the Melbourne, and I'm saying Melton is a good option. Again, of course, the witch hunt about Melton as well, and all of these other areas. That's when it usually happens. It used to stress me out, but I can't. I'm also worried, like what also happens sometimes in our community is that, let's say I talk about Werribee, for example.
Yes.
And people go and buy in Werribee. And then I'm like, hold on. And I always talk about Werribee or any area in context of all the other areas. And it's funny how mind just isolates something. People isolate something and go for it, and then they don't consider the larger context of what I actually said. Yeah. It does happen. I can't do anything about it, but the way I deal with it, as I always say, and people know that I've been doing this for years now, I always talk about brief, financial circumstance, connecting it to the area.
And I think Red, you and I, we do this a lot as well. So as we sort of talk on, we obviously talk about areas a lot, best areas, worst areas. But it's all in the sort of context of like who you are as an individual. Like
exactly.
I've spoken to 4 wildly different people over the last 2 or 3 days with wildly different goals, wildly different financial circumstances. One's a 51-year-old, one's a 28-year-old, So I can't just say this area is it for you. But within the certain frameworks, yes, there are areas that have certain fundamentals that speak to us, right? But I know Werribee is a topic for you. Can you go into Bunbury? I know there was a whole storm around Bunbury.
Yeah. Bunbury was another example when I was sort of, it's funny, people online, they either have the time or willingness to go into 100 rounds with people. So I don't have time nor mental capacity to actually do that. But, Bunbury was an example where people were saying, Bunbury is a great investment. And then I had a look at it, and then it's, by the way, had medium data confidence, which equals lower sale volumes, very unaffordable for its price point and the socioeconomic status of the residents. And then I said, and I always say, Bunbury is a good investment. You could have made, a substantial amount of money in the last 3 years, but what is the steam factor? Where's the ceiling? What is the threshold? Will you be making the same amount of money in the next 3 years? And it's interesting that people think that once I make 200K, they think that they will be making 200K all the time. They assume that it's going to be a perpetual hotspot.
Picked up on that.
Yeah.
You picked up on something, actually.
Yeah, I want to sort of stress on that, right? The Bunbury conversation with you, I remember it pretty clearly. It was sort of in this latter half of 2024. Mm-hmm. I remember you did the mastermind. You talked about why Bunbury might not be the right spot right now because of the unaffordability factors, etc. Yep. 2024. Now, if we put Matt from Hashtag in 2021, that would have been a different conversation. It would have been we're like, yeah, Bunbury's a great option. It's 300K. You know, you've got a 7%
Absolutely.
yield.
It was again, as I said before, it might have been much lower, 300, 400K. The socioeconomic status, which was low, would not play a big role for that price point. The affordability would have been high, supply would have been reducing, and demand would have been improving.
Love that.
You know, but I would, if I was investing there, I would say, okay, socioeconomics are very low. If it's going to double in value, it's going to hit 600K. And because I know there's barely, essentially no chance for a 600K to double in value with low socioeconomics, I would say I'll buy here, but I'll rethink in the next couple of years when it hits a certain mark whether I will exit.
Yes,
you know. So I would consider it from that perspective.
So many good nuggets there. We did a recent episode where we talked about the worst areas to invest in. If you haven't seen it, go check it out, and you will see some of the lessons that you've just picked up. We picked areas a little bit like Bunbury in terms of its numbers and analysis. Areas that have done really, really well in the last few years, but no longer are buys because the answer to that question changes depending on the price point and where it's at a particular
time frame. Exactly.
Time frame. So the Bunbury of 2021, great. Bunbury in late 2024, not so great. So the three areas that we picked up were just with that same framework that you've come up with, and the analysis of it is really, really clever. I want to pick your brain on this framework that you have. You've got it in your mind, and I'm learning from you here, where it's like the priority index of what data sets and the information that you're using and prioritizing them. I can see that from here. I can see that you're prioritizing affordability with relation to socioeconomics of the area. Is that right? I've got those two combined?
Yeah, those two combined, and supply scarcity, the third one.
And the supply scarcity. So
and you're starting, but before any of that, you're starting at a point that the confidence in the data that we have, like whatever we're looking at, it has to be statistically significant.
Correct.
And that's high.
So statistical significant, risk, affordability, socioeconomic, supply scarcity. You're 80% there.
So can I, with a lot of that, am I wrong in saying that this is going to rule out the majority of Sydney? Have I got this right? Is that too far if I'm going there because affordability will be so poor?
Good question. Great question. Now, we're talking about affordability, but affordability is a relative term depending on the location.
On the price
point. And
Sydney incomes aren't that great. It's not affordable.
And the price point. Now, but affordability index for price points that are between 1 to 1.5 million, you will go to an index of 45 or 50 years to own. You know, and you'll still, if you see reducing supply and an increasing demand, it will still happen. Now, you have to assess the steam, but when you're looking at lower price points, you must lower the affordability index. And you can see it from a data set how it changes. So when you go in higher price points, you can't always go, okay, let's say 30 years it takes to pay off a mortgage, yeah? So for price points that are, 500K and below, the affordability index should sit below 30 years to own. But we can't adopt the same rationale, and this is why, Addy, we change the index relative to the price point. But we sort of now, Narellan Vale, let's say Southwest Sydney, typical price 1.2 million. It's relatively affordable in comparison to everything else around it. Now, the process of elimination, it is relative and process of elimination. If anything, so I will, yes, the affordability index is higher, but I consider the affordability index in context of everything else. And then I ask myself, okay, would I invest in Sydney if there are other areas in Melbourne for the same price point that are more affordable?
Yes.
Okay, so that's how I analyze it. Now, you'll see in Melbourne as well, Melbourne had a huge increase, and then he sort of stagnated even when nosedive a little when it comes to a typical price. So affordability improved. The affordability can improve through time in Sydney, for example. Now, it will not improve dramatically, but will improve if the price is stagnating. So it might provide for more opportunity. Now, this is why GCC in Melbourne is a phenomenal opportunity because you're in the greater capital city region, and yet you're sitting in an index of 35 for Taylor Hills, for example. It's very affordable. So to answer your question in a more direct way, it's all comparative. If I'm investing in Sydney, the onus is on me to find the area with the best alignment of metrics, and one of these should be affordability.
Yes.
The second question I should ask myself is, what is the opportunity cost if I invest in Sydney in comparison to Melbourne or Queensland and other areas?
Of course.
So now, there is an implied notion within what you said is that areas still grow even though they're unaffordable.
Yes, that's true.
They still grow. Now, at what rate and for how long is the assessment?
Yes.
And my job is, again, as I said, okay, are there better opportunities than in Sydney? Or if I have to invest in Sydney, which areas have the highest levels of affordability with established supply scarcity and all of the socioeconomics in comparison to other areas in Sydney?
Yes.
That's how I approach it.
There's so much value there. So I've always found Sydney quite easily predictable from a macro perspective, and underlying that predictability is actually an affordability framework. I actually make it a little bit simpler where without the data metrics and things like that, just a very, very simple one with Sydney is in 2020, for example, where we were looking at numbers and a guy purchased a home with a granny flat, it had a 7% yield in Blacktown or something like that. Mm-hmm. And where rates were at the time.
So when?
2020.
2020. Yeah,
so,
okay.
Good time to buy in Sydney.
Yeah.
At that
Blacktown
time,
especially.
In Blacktown, he bought their house with a granny flat. At the time, that singular investment would produce and spin off enough cash flow to pay for his entire mortgage, and he had about a $900,000 mortgage. Yep. Now, the numbers attached to that is ridiculous, where it's just like, what? He's buying a property investment in Sydney, and it's going to pay off temporarily at least, it's going to be paying the mortgage for his owner occupier. The whole framework there is affordability in that time period, if we go back to many Sydney suburbs, would have been particularly strong, mainly because interest rates are 2%. Admittedly, across Australia, affordability would have been fantastic, right? But that framework, I use rent or buy as just a very, very basic equation in the conversations that we have with people. It's just like, hey, are you renting or buying? What's the cost difference? In Sydney at the moment, it is extraordinary. It's very, very expensive to own versus to rent because yields are so low and affordability sucks at the moment. So I actually think it's a very, very powerful way to assess a marketplace and assess its capacity. And the golden nugget that he actually provided there, you actually provide one absolute wisdom ball of gold. And we've been saying it a lot on this podcast as well, is, and Adi's used it so magically. We've got a little clip of it on our Instagram where it's just like, you can buy in Melbourne in many suburbs for $600,000-700,000 at the moment, and the years to own, the affordability framework is pretty good relative to Melbourne, and it's a greater capital there. And over the context of history, that is particularly favorable. Where if rates continue to come down and normalize, if that does happen, then you're in a position where it's just like affordability is extremely strong here. The rental buy equation could actually equalize, except you're sitting on a decent block of a house or something like that, 20 kilometers from the CBD in Melbourne. It's attractive.
You said a lot of things there that are very important. First, foremost, getting back to the Blacktown, I mean, when it was bought in 2020, and you had a huge cash flow component, the granny flat.
Yes.
It would have been under a different strategy for a different need. When we talk about purely market momentum without any value adds or anything, affordability becomes crucial. But then in some instances, although it was favorable at that time, the cash flow component really subsidized for everything else, Also, the buy and rent thing, and this is what so when we talked about vacancy rates, and I say when vacancy rates reduce to a point where rents are increasing too fast, you usually see, remember how I said, you usually see a transition between demand for vacancies into days on market for demand for ownership. Because when rents are too high and it becomes more sensible to own, you see a transition between rental to owning.
Yes.
So that's how you, again, connecting metrics into dots, and you see, and this is how you assess it, and that it's common sense. I mean, if it's on par to rent and buy, I'll buy.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I? Yeah, it makes more sense. Can I ask you something? You've deep dived into this data for like years, right? What is that because obviously it's an illiquid asset, right? It doesn't, probably doesn't exchange hands very, very often. What does that transition phase look like? Have you sort of seen, is there like a nugget there where it's like, over 4 years, typically if the rents have increased too dramatically, that's when the switch to home ownership starts to happen, and then yields start to sort of balance out.
Yeah, I don't have a figure or a number. The way I do it is, if there is so if I see, and this is what I call a warm spot.
Yes.
If I see relative levels of affordability present, supply scarcity, i.e. you see a reduction in supply for the last 4 or 5 years across all domains with stock on market, inventory, building approvals and hold periods. And then I see a flat demand, i.e. a trend that's not reducing, but I see a nosediving trend in vacancy rates.
Yeah.
It's a sign for me, and there's like probably a 2-year time lag, where I know it's a warm spot. I know, and usually what happens in that instance is the long-term trend for days on market will be flat. But if you look at the recent, let's say last year, you'll see most of the DOM recorded in the last year is actually below the trend.
Yeah.
So the short-term trend for days on market is improving. That's a perfect sign. And then people ask me, how do you know it will turn into a hotspot? Just think about it. You don't have enough property to buy. Affordability is high. Short-term demand is improving. And yields have been increasing phenomenally in the last couple of years.
What's the logical next step? Can I make a little plug for Alex here? Because I remember 12 months ago, Alex sat down in front of, I don't know how many, co-founder of H-Tag, sat down in front of, I don't know how many buyers, agents, investors, etc. And he talked about Melbourne at a time where Melbourne was just not the hot topic, right? And he talked about exactly this. We've seen this shift happening in Melbourne, back in sort of early 2024, where we knew that some of the data that we play, that's playing out. We've talked about Carrum Downs on this podcast. We've talked about Narre Warren. We talked about Frankston. All of these areas are starting to show that shift now, right? There's a line of people out. So Alex, kudos. It was very brave of you to do it at the time, and
that's so clever. There's that little nugget. I kind of want to ball that up and show everyone and repeat it to everyone en masse. So I just want to simplify it a little bit for everyone else. So for the audience, let's simplify that. Matt is the data mind in Australia, but many of you are listening to this and may not fully comprehend the enormity of what he just said there. What I picked up there is quite often you can find that spot, that marketplace that's going to do particularly well in the medium term that isn't doing well right now, exactly where you want to be as a property investor. That's probably tip number one, exactly where you want to be. You don't want to be elbowing competition away, using your expression on the Everything Property podcast. You want to be buying an area where you can go and participate in, buy actively, and there's not that much competition yet, but it's going to do well in about a year's time. It's going to start getting its real momentum there. But you actually said, pay attention to the rental market. And you linked it back that a falling vacancy rate. A vacancy rate is a measurement of rental stock available in a marketplace. If there's less rental stock available in the marketplace, rents will start pushing up. And then you actually told the story in there. The story is those renters are going to be part of the people that are adding in the purchases as well. They're going to go from the rental market to buying.
Correct. When rents increase to a point where it becomes more sensible to own.
Exactly. And that's popped up in the days on market data, which is one of the early trend indicators that you're starting to go from warmer to hot. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. I mean, the trend can last for 4 or 5 years, but you can segregate the trend into chunks. And you say, okay, in the last 4 years it's flat, but in the last year it's been reducing.
Yes.
And 1 year is a substantial time frame. And if you can see essentially what I mean reducing, average days on market for 4 years was 45 days. However, in the last year, it's 30, 28, 32, Brilliant. 27. Yep. It's below the trend. It's constantly below the trend for a period of a year, and yet the rents are skyrocketing.
Yes. So just again to the audience, days on market is how long it takes for a property to sell. So the vacancy rate means that the number of homes available to rent are coming down. There's more renters in the marketplace. Then you're going to start seeing in the data, if you're starting to look at it, that the time it takes to sell a home is starting to come down. It's selling quicker.
Correct.
That is the narrative. That's kind of the trajectory of the data that you have, and it follows the human story. The human story there is the data is just capturing the behavior that's happening on the ground.
Absolutely.
And that's the step-by-step of what's going on.
Can I add one more thing to it, right? So the rents are increasing, right? Because we want to simplify this down as much as possible. The rents are increasing. Renters are now starting to add to the buyer pool as well. So price growth is starting to happen. We're starting to see the shift in price growth. But remember, as rents are increasing, vacancy rates are falling, more investors are attracted to that market because they're like, whoa, this was 3.5% last year. It's that combination of, renters are now becoming buyers. There's more buyers now. Remember, the supply is still low, right? That's still going down. Now you're adding investors into the pool. And we're talking about the Perth, right? We're talking about the Perths of the world. Like 2020, when you look at the data, this is what you were showing on Instagram.
So absolutely. And people ask me, how do you know that it works? November 6th, 2023, a buyer's agent approached me and asked me, Matt, what do I do? Everyone's talking about Perth. I'm a bit worried. How do I find the next Perth, or do I just ride the wave? This is what I did. I looked at supply, demand, affordability, vacancy rates, and I said buy in Townsville.
I remember the screenshot.
Yeah, and I even have it, like I don't, but people ask me, okay, you talk about these stories about data, where's your social proof? Then I have then it was the Melbourne thing. In April 2024, Alex did a presentation to BAI where there was heaps of buyers agents at the time where Perth that was it. I mean, if you mention Melbourne, you'll get attacked. Literally, He did a presentation and said Melbourne's going to be the next GCC hotspot. GCC, by the way. And he said not regional Melbourne, he said GCC. It's clearly outlined in the video, and he went through 30 metrics. It was a very proper presentation. Then, when Melbourne started heating up, I took screenshots, remember, in our mastermind where, which areas people, what do you think about Karoom Downs? Or what do you think about this area? I said, and I have explanations that I took screenshots of. Now there's 30 people lining up for the home.
That's right.
You know what I mean? Like that's what I'm saying.
That's
the
the
man that
hashtag
moves
of it.
market.
Yeah,
The man that moves
it's not.
market.
It's actually. It's not. I'm moving the market.
Yeah.
It is.
You're just
I don't
seeing
need
it
to
early.
move the market. It's all there in front of you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's all there. Just read it.
Actually, you're the man that's made it all in front of everyone, though. That's
made-
the new bit. If
You've
that makes sense.
democratized it, right?
When you provide that information to
and
people,
this is what
they're
people
reading it.
people ask me. Okay, Matt, is hashtag a self-fulfilling prophecy? That coincides. That coincides with the question Matt is flaunting it or pushing
Flogging
areas
something.
because they don't actually understand that. I mean, we do have a crossover of 1,000 markets that are favourable, but everyone is buying in different markets because of their brief. Now, the reason why people ask me, okay, when you're going through the filtering, why do you first address the supply side and not demand? And I say, because I don't control the supply. I control the demand. If there's 1,000 members in hashtag or 2,000 maybe is hashtag and I tell them go all to Karoom Downs, we're going to control the supply side of the equation. Like some buyers agents are putting people in Ballarat, buying 100 properties a month. But if supply is not restricted, they're still sitting on the sidelines for 4 years, not actually extracting equity. So I restrict first what I can't control, and then what I can control, it's going to play along. So it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy because I've firstly targeted markets that I don't have a play in. I can't, I don't deal, even if I'm a developer, I can't shape the supply side of the equation in the market,
Can I ask, we'll do this quickly. I want like quick little answers from you now on different sort of marketplaces. We're going to go a bit general here. So I'll do a couple of them together. Adelaide and Perth, places that exhibit much lower yields after big growth cycles, close to doubled in like 4 years, both of those, not quite, but close. Much lower yields now, sitting at their lowest yields in a long time. Maybe Perth not so much, but Adelaide 3.6%, whatever it is. Are these markets in broad frameworks? Affordability would just be like, and affordability and the ISAD score that you talk about. Broad brush, are they in a macro context? You're going to find it harder to find suburbs that exhibit frameworks of good short to medium term growth.
Yeah, so I believe those markets lack steam in the next short term.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Which
Brisbane?
is an issue.
Brisbane?
Brisbane, no. Brisbane doesn't lack steam. When I say Brisbane, you mean Queensland or Brisbane?
I mean Brisbane specifically.
Brisbane is for higher price points. Most of the investor activity was happening in the regional markets.
Yes.
And I predominantly search for investors. So it's usually the regional markets pop up.
Yep.
Brisbane is not, Brisbane has definitely steam. It's not like Perth and Adelaide, but in all honesty, I'm not going to put my hand to heart and now know exactly because I haven't analysed the Brisbane market in a long time, specifically because of the higher price points.
Yeah.
But the regional market in Queensland is doing well and it still has steam, 2 or 3 years maybe.
Yep.
Melbourne, if we're going to Melbourne.
Let's go to Melbourne next. Yeah.
Melbourne is a market that's just kicking off. And Melbourne is, again, different to Queensland in a sense that if I had to pick between Brisbane, GCC and Melbourne, I'll pick Melbourne.
Yes.
Agree. Yep. Can I ask the audience's favorite? I keep getting told this. A little while ago on this very podcast, I was talking about the study of behavior. Again, the economics framework, ex-treasury economists, that's the way we think, right? You're using data to get a bit more specifics in terms of suburbs, but I was talking about behavior. I was assessing the information that I'm getting from all the clients we represent and all the buyers agents that we represent. And I was just doing the math here. It'd be like, a lot of these people are working off a principle of, I need a yield of 6%. I buy a house that's existing and I typically buy in a capital city, or if you can call Darwin that, but I typically buy with these sort of data frameworks. And now I can't buy in Perth, I can't buy in Adelaide, I can't buy in Brisbane, I can't buy in Sydney, I can't buy in Melbourne. I know about North Queensland, yes, but I was working off the process of elimination that...
Absolutely, I know where you're going with this,
I'm just simply working off elimination.
Absolutely.
And then there's some other frameworks, strengthening employment markets, a story you can sell, essentially. And I'm like, Darwin is going to be the next place where they all go. I said this about 6 to 12 months ago. It's on this very podcast.
I have a confession to make about that, by the way.
Yes.
Sorry to cut you off. He was popping up in our shortlist all the time. Remember, Adi? Like Darwin was popping up.
I told you yesterday?
It was popping up all the time. Using the framework that we use, essentially supply and demand dynamic economics, It was popping up, and I was the first one. I always tell people, don't have bias. Just look at what the data says, And I'm like, Darwin, don't worry about it. It was always first or second. And now it's been popping up, and I'm seeing activity over there, and I'm seeing buyers agents buying and the sales agents saying, and I'll look over the data set again. And I made the same mistake that I tell people not to make. I said, don't let the bias inform your decision making, and it actually happened in terms of Darwin. But Darwin has been in the shortlist, most of the shortlist for the 600K typical price. It's been about 8 months, man. So I completely agree. I completely agree. In a roundabout way, I'm telling you, well done.
It's so funny. Me and you almost said the same thing. I probably articulated it not as well yesterday. I was like, yep, it started popping up in sort of my radar as well.
Yeah.
And I was just like, it's Darwin. I've been there. There's like 12 people. I think it was 7 yesterday. The population's grown since yesterday.
It's actually really. I love that. It's actually really strange, Matt. Like, I'm actually talking about this. I mean this in the kindest of ways. I'm actually talking about the rise of. I want to put it in a kind way, but the rise of your influence. It's not you so much, only you, but it's influential characters. And I'm going to put my hand up. It's a new thing for me as well. Like, I get stopped a lot. Like, people are watching this, people are hearing it, and the influence that we are having, and then it's across a number of players. Like, there's a concentration of influence that have happened that didn't quite exist in a pre-social media sort of dominated world and in this YouTube world. So like, if one YouTuber, I'm a YouTuber now, so this is a bit awkward, but if one YouTuber with a large amount of following says something, it can actually create some waves into a marketplace. But if all of them are copying the same brief, right? And that was the brief. The brief is that, and then they're using data metrics to go and do it, being like, oh, there's so many people using data. I'm like, oh, this is easy. Like, I can tell you where they're going to go next because they will move the data a little bit. So there was an element of studying
That's a great metric
behavior.
right there. That's a great metric that I'll think about because honestly, and I wanted to always discern a different way of using sentiment. Search, Google search engines, like how do they, like, I mean, we do have buy and search indexes and they're a couple of degrees of separation to a purchase, but no, I mean, I absolutely, and by the way, I purposely never promoted Darwin or never said anything about it, but he was always in the shortlist. He was always the top 3, not in the shortlist, i.e. not lurking in the 25th place. He was always in the top 3. Now it's first all the time. Durac, for example,
It's a Coley.
Yeah. I mean, and think about
me up first.
Yeah.
Are they popping out?
Yeah.
First?
Look.
Crazy.
But
I want to talk about Humpty Doo because it's Humpty Doo. That's why. There's a Humpty Doo.
Really?
I
didn't even know. I thought it was a joke. Yeah, but I mean, look at Durac. Socioeconomics 8 out of 10. Affordability at 18 years to own. Supply
the
reducing.
Banks basically pay you. It's the affordability index.
Yield at 7 or 8. I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah.
Like, it's crazy. And then again, people say, but he didn't grow at all before, or but everything. Perth didn't grow for 15 years, and then you made 100% in 3.
Love this, everyone. I'm gonna just give a little recap. This was not by design. We haven't done any prep work. There was no transcript, no conversations beforehand. Matt has kindly drove down and come in here and sat down and had a chat with me. I've had an absolute blast with you, Matt. I really have.
Brother.
I've
Thanks,
learned
likewise.
a lot, and I can't say that. I've been in the industry a long time, and when I learn something, I'm getting a kick out of it, being like, this is fun. Like, little tingles are going out, being like, hey, I'm learning something about property because your mind is so good. But the thing that I wanted to reiterate to everyone, and why I'm saying that we haven't caught up beforehand, is I might come at it with a bit of a different lens, not looking at this bit so much, but the conclusions that we've kind of had on this podcast many, many times. We go around the grounds all the time, and I change my mind. You'll see at different points, I will say Sydney's go, and many times I say Sydney kind of sucks, not so good. I've been saying that for a little while now, and now we're talking about Melbourne. We've been talking about Darwin for a little bit of time. There was no coincidence here. This isn't a confirmation bias podcast. It is just a study of data, a study of behavior, a study of economics, and Matt is pretty much the best in the business when it comes to that. Adi, absolute pleasure with you as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you for
This was
bringing Matt in together
Thank
as
you,
well.
gents.
It's
No, it
been
was
a
great.
pleasure, Matt.
It was great.
Cheers.
It was great. Thank you for having me.